Have you ever noticed how 20th-century wars suspiciously hit Tartarian city centers with uncanny precision? Not just cities got bombed. I mean the old heart of the city. The part with the huge stone buildings, the tall doors, the strange grand halls. Keeps getting hit like a bullseye. Look at the before photos. A tight, crowded center. Old squares, old stations, old bridges, heavy stone walls. Now, look at the after. The center is gone. Not one street, not one block. Whole neighborhoods erased, like someone used war as an eraser. And here's the part that should bother you. When you overlay old maps with war damage maps, the worst destruction often sits right where the oldest, strangest architecture was packed together, again and again. Across different countries, across different armies, same pattern. So, what was it really? Bad luck, military logic, or something else? Something nobody wanted left standing when the smoke cleared? Because after the bombs came the second hit, the rebuild, new roads, new blocks, new plans. And suddenly the old city doesn't just look damaged, it looks rewritten. So tell me, if this was just war, why does it keep landing on the same kind of places with the same kind of results? Like the past was being targeted on purpose? I wasn't looking for patterns when I started comparing photographs. I was researching European architecture, 19th century train stations, old civic halls, the usual academic rabbit holes that swallow entire weekends. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. And then I saw the overlay. Someone had placed a war damage map over an 1890 city plan. Dresden. The red zones, total destruction, sat almost perfectly inside the boundaries of the oldest quarter. Not the factories, not the rail yards at the city's edge, the stone heart, the grand center, the part with the tall doorways and the massive halls that supposedly belonged to a much smaller population. I scrolled to another city, Warsaw, same technique, old map underneath, damage map on top. And there it was again, the red zone eating the center like acid burning through a photograph. Coincidence? It had to be. Cities pack important buildings downtown. Bombs hit important buildings. The simple geometry of war. But then I kept scrolling. Cologne, the ancient cathedral somehow still standing, but everything around it flattened in a near-perfect ring. Rotterdam. The entire medieval core erased while the port facilities suffered comparatively modest damage. Coventry. The old walled city reduced to rubble while the outer industrial belt stayed functional enough to keep producing. And here's the part that started to bother me. These weren't surgical strikes in an age of precision weapons. These were mass raids through clouds at night, using tools and navigation that could miss by hundreds of meters, sometimes a kilometer or more. The official record says this plainly. Bombing in the 1940s was not accurate. Crews dropped on general areas, not specific addresses. So, why do the damage patterns look so specific? Take any before photograph of these cities. What do you see? Dense, ornate centers. Buildings made of massive stone blocks. Doorways 12 to 15 feet high. Stairwells wide enough for 3 people to walk abreast. Windows scaled for rooms with 18-foot ceilings. Architecture that historians politely label ceremonial, civic, or representative of 19th century grandeur. Now take the after photograph. Same angle, same street, same coordinates. Gone, not damaged, not burned out and rebuilt. Gone, the ground scraped clean, ready for something new. Something modern, something with standard 8-foot ceilings and doors that match the people walking through them. The first city I could dismiss. The second made me curious. By the 5th, I was taking notes. By the 10th, I was hunting for explanations that didn't include the word coincidence. Because here's what the damage maps show when you look at them without excuses. The hits don't scatter randomly the way inaccurate bombing should scatter. They cluster, they concentrate. They keep finding the oldest, densest, strangest parts of the urban core with a precision the era supposedly couldn't deliver. Military historians have explanations for this. Rail junctions sat in city centers. Government buildings needed destroying. Communication hubs required elimination. And all of this is true. All of this is documented. But it doesn't explain why the destruction often spreads well beyond those legitimate targets. It doesn't explain why entire neighborhoods of residential buildings, old residential buildings, stone residential buildings, buildings with oversized everything, vanished while industrial facilities at the city's edge remained standing. Ask yourself something. If you were trying to destroy a nation's war-making capacity, would you focus on the factories or the architecture? And yet, when the smoke cleared and the maps were redrawn, it wasn't factories that vanished from the urban landscape. It was the old quarters, the stone quarters, the parts of European cities that looked nothing like the mid-20th century and looked even less like what came after. I kept staring at those overlays. Old map, damage map, old map, damage map. The pattern held, across borders, across years, across opposing armies who supposedly had nothing in common except mutual destruction. Whatever hit these cities hit the same kind of places, every single time, every single time. That phrase kept circling in my head as I pulled up the first proper overlay, the kind where someone had done the work correctly. Geo-referenced the historical map, aligned the coordinates, and laid the destruction data on top with care. Dresden, 1892, a city plan drawn when the old quarter still stood in its full density. Narrow streets radiating from central squares, stone buildings packed tight against each other, their footprints irregular and organic, shaped by centuries, not by neat modern planning. The Altstadt, the old city, stood out as a heavy mass of architecture, separate from the newer rings spreading outward. Now, the damage overlay from February 1945. The red zone, total destruction, doesn't spread evenly. It doesn't follow the messy scatter you'd expect from aircraft dropping bombs through cloud cover, smoke, and anti-aircraft fire. It sits, it concentrates. It finds the Altstadt the way a hand finds a familiar pocket. The conventional explanation showed up immediately in almost every source I opened. Dresden was a transportation hub. Several rail lines converged there. The old city contained government buildings, communication centers, military administration offices, legitimate targets, and I accepted this. For about an hour. Then I started measuring. The rail yards sat primarily to the north and west of the historic center. The major industrial facilities, the optics factories, the armaments works, clustered farther out. The communication infrastructure, while partly centralized, also stretched across the wider city. But the firestorm that consumed Dresden in February 1945 didn't behave like a clean strike on a few specific targets. The bombers came in waves. The first wave dropped high explosives to crack open roofs and walls. The second wave dropped incendiaries to ignite the exposed interiors. The third wave dropped more incendiaries to feed the growing inferno. Standard tactics for the era. Nothing strange in the method itself. What was strange was the footprint. The firestorm consumed approximately 1,600 acres of the city center. It burned so hot, the stone itself changed, calcified, warped, turned brittle. It created winds strong enough to pull people off their feet and drag them toward the flames. It erased not only buildings, but streets, foundations, any clear sign that something had stood there at all. And when the fires finally died, Dresden's entire medieval core had vanished. The Baroque additions were gone. The Renaissance palaces were ash. What remained were the suburbs, the industrial zones, and a handful of structures at the very edge of the destruction, survivors that escaped the burning radius by a few meters. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. The bombing of Dresden has been studied for decades. Historians argue about the death toll, the military necessity, the moral weight of it. But almost no one asks the most basic cartographic question, the one you can see in seconds if you stop and look. Why does the damage zone match the old city boundaries so precisely? Look at the overlay again. The red zone doesn't spill far into the 19th century developments. It doesn't sprawl deep into the industrial belt. It lands on the oldest architecture with what looks, on a map, like intention. Inaccurate bombing should produce messy results. Scatter, uneven spreads, random clustering. Some targets hit, others missed, damage shaped by wind and chance and the chaos of night raids. But that's not what the Dresden overlay shows. It shows a bullseye. And the bullseye sits exactly where the strangest, oldest, most oversized architecture once stood. I needed a second city. Different country, different combatants, different goals. If the pattern held, coincidence got harder to defend. If it didn't, I could close my laptop and go back to normal research. Warsaw, different war, different army, different ideology. And yet, the overlay technique worked the same way. An 1880 city plan aligned with a 1944 damage assessment. And there it was again, the red zone finding the Stermiasto, the old town with that same disturbing precision, the same concentration of destruction on the same kind of dense stone core. The Germans didn't just bomb Warsaw, they dismantled it after the uprising, building by building, block by block. A different method than Dresden, a colder, slower kind of destruction. Same result. The old city, the stone city, the city with the tall doors and the massive halls, erased down to the foundations. Two different wars, two different armies, two different methods of destruction. Same pattern, same type of target, same outcome. I pulled up a third city, then a fourth. Then I stopped counting and started documenting. Because the pattern wasn't breaking, it was getting stronger. It was getting stronger. Each overlay I examined added weight to a pattern I didn't want to see. Dresden could be explained, Warsaw could be rationalized. But by the time I reached the fifth, sixth, seventh city, the explanation started taking more effort than the pattern itself. Rotterdam, May 1940. The German Luftwaffe bombed the city center for approximately 15 minutes. 15 minutes. That's how long it took to wipe out 900 years of accumulated architecture. The medieval core, the part tourists would have photographed, the part with canal houses, stone churches, and merchant halls with oversized doorways, vanished in a quarter hour. The port, however, remained functional. This matters. Rotterdam was one of the largest ports in the world. If the goal was to cripple Dutch resistance, destroying the harbor infrastructure would have done it fast. Instead, the bombers hit the city center, the old city center, the part that, on paper, had little to do with shipping capacity or direct military logistics. The official explanation is simple. The bombing was meant to force Dutch surrender, terror tactics, break civilian morale by destroying civilian spaces. And maybe that's true. Maybe the destruction of medieval churches and Renaissance guild halls was meant to shock and scare, nothing more. Maybe there's no deeper pattern here. But then why does the same footprint show up in cities bombed by the Allies? Cologne. The British and Americans bombed this city again and again throughout the war. Over 200 air raids. The destruction became so complete that post-war photographs show the cathedral standing alone in a moonscape of rubble, the only vertical structure visible for blocks in every direction. The cathedral survived. Everything around it didn't. And what was everything around it? The Altstadt, the old city, Roman foundations, a medieval street plan, buildings that had stood for centuries, some with proportions that feel wrong, doors and halls that look scaled for bodies larger than the ones walking through them in the 20th century. Gone, all of it. And within about 2 decades, much of it was replaced by modern structures with modern proportions, and modern explanations that made the older layer harder to even imagine. I kept searching for a city that would break the pattern, a European urban center where the old quarter survived while the industrial zones burned. A place where inaccurate bombing produced the scattered, messy destruction that inaccurate bombing should produce. I'm still searching. Coventry. The medieval center destroyed. The automotive factories damaged, but recoverable. Hamburg. The firestorm consumed dense old quarters while the U-boat pens, the actual strategic target, remained a problem, requiring specialized weapons developed specifically because conventional bombing couldn't reliably destroy them. Würzburg. Roughly 90% of the historic center destroyed in 17 minutes. A city with no major war industry. A city whose main value, on the surface, was its Baroque architecture and its Prince Bishop's residence, halls and doorways that don't make sense if you picture the normal-sized lives those buildings are supposed to serve. The pattern refused to break. And it wasn't limited to Germany. It wasn't limited to Allied bombing campaigns. Stalingrad. The old city center, the part built before Soviet standardization, annihilated, while the tractor factory that produced tanks stayed contested ground precisely because it still stood and still mattered. Kyiv. The historic Kriegsschatzung, destroyed not by bombs from the sky, but by demolition charges after the German occupation began. The official story says buildings were booby-trapped by retreating forces, but witnesses described explosions continuing for days, moving through the oldest structures in a way that felt systematic, while newer Soviet buildings often survived. Different wars, different armies, different ideologies, different methods, same type of targets, same kind of results. So I started making a list. Cities where the old center suffered disproportionate destruction compared to industrial and military infrastructure. Cities where the strangest architecture, the oversized proportions, the massive stone, construction, the features that don't match the neat story of recent origins, disappeared while more modern structures stood a better chance of surviving. The list kept growing. It crossed borders and decades. It included enemies who became allies and allies who became enemies. And it suggested something no single bombing campaign could fully explain. Whatever was being destroyed, it didn't look like an accident. And whatever replaced it, it followed a pattern that felt less like normal rebuilding, and more like a controlled rewrite. One word kept appearing in my notes, underlined again and again. Erasure. Not damage, not destruction. Erasure. As if the goal wasn't only to win a war, as if the goal was to delete something from the historical record itself, as if the goal was to delete something from the historical record itself. That thought kept returning as I studied what exactly had been deleted. Not just buildings, not just neighborhoods, a specific type of construction, a specific architectural language that shows up across countries and cultures with a consistency that feels wrong. I need to describe it carefully, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Start with the doors, not the big ceremonial entrances built to impress. I mean functional doors, interior doors, corridor doors, doors in offices, residences, and back hallways where grand design serves no practical purpose. These doors stand 12 to 15 feet high. Their handles sit closer to shoulder level for a modern adult. Their proportions look like they were made for users larger than the people we're told lived and worked there in the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, the windows. Same logic. Sills set higher than you'd expect. Openings stretching upward towards ceilings that reach 18, 20, sometimes even 25 feet, in spaces described as ordinary in period accounts. Glass panes and frames scaled for rooms that visually dwarf the supposed day-to-day life inside them. The staircases follow the same pattern, treads deeper than modern comfort guidelines suggest. Risers shaped in a way that changes your stride, less step-step, and more long pace. Handrails placed for hands reaching from a greater height. Stair widths that allow 3, sometimes 4 people to walk abreast in buildings supposedly made for smaller populations than those living today. And then there's the stonework. This is where the pattern becomes harder to shrug off. Massive blocks, fitted with precision that modern engineers can replicate, but not cheaply, not quickly, and not without heavy machines. Foundations extending deeper than the structure above would seem to require, walls thicker than climate or security would normally demand. A style that signals permanence measured in ages, not in decades. This look has a name in certain circles. They call it Tartarian. The word is controversial. It appears on old maps, Tartaria, Grande Tartari, Tartari, as a label for vast territories across Eurasia. What it meant to the map makers is still debated. A political entity, a geographic region, a civilization, or a loose label outsiders use because they didn't know what else to call it. I'm not here to settle that debate. The label matters less than what it points to, because whether you call it Tartarian, imperial, ceremonial, or simply old civic architecture, these buildings share traits that don't sit neatly with their assigned origin stories. They look too advanced for some of their claim dates. They use methods that later builders struggled to copy when expansions or repairs were needed. And they exist in quantities and patterns that feel more like infrastructure than isolated monuments. And then comes the detail that ties everything together. They cluster in the exact zones 20th-century wars, erased with such unsettling precision. Go back to the overlays. Dresden's Altstadt, Warsaw's Stare Miasto, Rotterdam's medieval core, Cologne's cathedral quarter. The red zones don't just show destruction. They often map the removal of a specific architectural type, The tall doors, the oversized proportions, the heavy stone construction that doesn't fit the simple story of normal people building normal spaces for people exactly like us. This is what vanished. This is what the firestorms consumed. This is what systematic demolitions cleared, and what post-war rebuilding replaced with concrete, glass, steel, and standard 8-foot ceilings. Coincidence only works if the destruction is random, but what I kept seeing wasn't random. It was patterned. The same pattern, repeating across different wars, different armies, different stated objectives, buildings that looked like they belonged to someone else, architecture that forces uncomfortable questions: who built it, when, and why the proportions seem to assume occupants we don't acknowledge. So I started collecting photographs of what survived, fragments at the edges of destruction zones, single structures that escaped the burning radius by meters, basements and foundations exposed when everything above them was blasted away, and the survivors whisper the same story as the casualties. The scale doesn't match the narrative. The construction often exceeds what the official record makes feel reasonable. The proportions hint at inhabitants who weren't average, and maybe weren't rare either, and someone, over decades, across borders, across opposing ideologies, made sure most of that evidence burned. Not all of it. They couldn't erase everything, but enough. Enough to make the questions harder to ask. Enough to make the pattern easy to deny. Enough to make you sound unreasonable for noticing what the old photographs still preserve. Enough to make you sound unreasonable for noticing what the old photographs preserve. And that's exactly why most people never look closer. The pattern hides in plain sight, because seeing it forces you to ask questions that sound ridiculous, right up until you line the evidence up and actually stare at it. Questions that stretch beyond one war, beyond one country, beyond one tragic exception. Questions that connect enemies who supposedly shared nothing except the desire to win. I realized I'd been thinking too small. Dresden, Warsaw, Rotterdam, Cologne, those are World War II, the great firestorm of the 20th century, the conflict that reshaped Europe and made unprecedented destruction feel explainable as military necessity. It's easy to file everything under the madness of total war and move on. But the pattern didn't start in 1939, and it didn't end in 1945. Go back further: World War I, Ypres, the medieval cloth. Hall, one of the largest commercial buildings of the Middle Ages, a structure whose proportions never fully made sense for mere commerce, was reduced to rubble by artillery. Reconstruction took decades and followed the old plans. But the original was gone. Whatever its measurements hinted at, whatever its stonework could have proven, survived only in photographs and drawings. Leuven, the university library, burned in 1914. German troops set the fire deliberately. 25,000 books vanished, along with the building that held them, a building with the same oversized proportions, the same heavy stone language, the same architectural vocabulary that would later burn across the continent. Rams Cathedral, shelled repeatedly. The official explanation: German forces targeted it because French observers used the towers, perhaps. But the shape of the story still repeats. The oldest, strangest, most anomalous structures drawing fire, while more obvious strategic targets stayed contested, damaged, fought over, repaired, damaged again. Now move forward, past 1945, into the Cold War and beyond. The rebuilding programs after World War II didn't just repair what was damaged. They redesigned cities from the ground up. Urban planners arrived with blueprints for a new world: wide roads for automobiles, standardized housing blocks, commercial centers built around efficiency and clean geometry. And the rubble of the old cities made that redesign easy. No long preservation fights, no heritage arguments that slowed the clock. No awkward questions about buildings that didn't match their own paperwork. Just empty land, broken populations, and an urgent demand to house people fast. In Warsaw, they rebuilt the old town using photographs and paintings. A replica, a careful facsimile of what had stood. But the original stones, the original foundations, the original physical evidence of whoever built the first version, gone. Carted away as rubble. Recycled into new concrete, buried under modern blocks that would never ask the same uncomfortable questions the old construction asked by simply existing. In Dresden, The Frauenkirche sat as a pile of blackened stones for decades. The German Democratic Republic left it standing, if you can call it standing, as a war memorial. Only after reunification did reconstruction begin. New materials, new techniques. A building that looks like the original, but no longer carries the same physical fingerprints. In Coventry, they built a new cathedral beside the ruins of the old one. Modern architecture next to medieval remains. A public statement about moving forward, about not being trapped by loss. And that's the rhythm you keep seeing. Forward, forward, forward. New plans, new proportions, new explanations. The old evidence replaced with replicas, memorials, and neat stories that don't require anyone to ask why certain buildings looked the way they looked in the first place. Then I noticed something else. The same kind of clearing didn't happen only inside declared wars. Chicago, 1871, the Great Fire. The story everyone knows is a cow kicking over a lantern. The result was real either way. A central city wiped out, including buildings that early photographs show with those same strange proportions. Oversized doors, heavy stonework, a scale that feels out of place for a young American city. San Francisco, 1906. Earthquake and fire. Destruction concentrated in the oldest quarters. Rebuilding was fast, modern, and practical. And the architectural anomalies visible in pre-disaster photographs largely vanish from the new city that rises in their place. So the pattern expands, beyond wars, beyond declared conflicts, into disasters that just happen to clear the same kind of evidence, in the same kind of places again and again. One war can be military necessity. One disaster can be bad luck, but a century of destruction, different continents, different causes, different official explanations, still hitting the same architectural vocabulary, still removing the same type of old core. That doesn't feel like coincidence. That feels like a pattern waiting for someone willing to name it. That's a pattern looking for someone willing to name it. But before naming anything, I need to be honest about what the evidence actually supports. Because there are legitimate explanations for why city centers burned. There are reasons that don't require conspiracy or coordination or uncomfortable questions about erased civilizations. I owe it to the pattern to test it against the obvious objections. Start with geography. 19th century cities grew around their centers. Rail lines converged downtown because that's where passengers and freight needed to go. Government buildings clustered in historic cores because that's where governments had always operated. Communication infrastructure, telegraph, and offices, telephone exchanges, postal hubs occupied central locations for the same reasons they do today. When military planners identified strategic targets, they identified city centers, not because of architecture, because of function. This explains a significant portion of the destruction. Rail yards needed elimination. Command centers required neutralization. Communication networks demanded disruption. And all of these legitimate military objectives sat in the same zones where the oldest, strangest buildings stood. Correlation, not causation. The Tartarian architecture burned because it happened to occupy strategically valuable land, nothing more. Now add the technological limitations of the era. Bombing in the 1940s was not precise. Aircraft navigated by dead reckoning, radio beams, and visual landmarks when weather permitted. Bombardiers aimed at general areas, not specific addresses. A successful raid meant hitting somewhere within a mile of the intended target. Under these conditions, bombs scattered. They fell on residential neighborhoods, on churches, on schools, on everything surrounding the actual military objectives. The destruction of historic centers wasn't targeting. It was spillover. Collateral damage on a massive scale. The firestorms that consumed Dresden and Hamburg followed their own physics. Once ignited, they spread according to wind patterns, building density, and available fuel. They didn't discriminate between military infrastructure and medieval architecture. They burned whatever would burn. This explains more of the pattern. The old quarters were dense. The buildings pressed against each other with narrow streets between. Perfect conditions for fire to jump from structure to structure, for isolated blazes to merge into infernos, for entire neighborhoods to vanish in hours. Geography, technology, physics. 3 explanations that require no conspiracy. 3 reasons why the overlays show what they show without invoking. Deliberate erasure of inconvenient evidence. I wanted these explanations to be sufficient. I wanted to close my files and return to normal research and accept that wars destroy cities and city centers contain old buildings, and therefore old buildings get destroyed. But the explanations kept leaking. If rail yards were the targets, why did the destruction so often spare the rail yards themselves? In city after city, the train stations survived while the quarters around them burned. Dresden's main station stood damaged but functional, while the Altstadt was ash. If communication infrastructure was the priority, why did the bombing patterns extend so far beyond the telephone exchanges and telegraph offices? The destruction radii exceeded any plausible targeting of specific facilities. If firestorms spread randomly according to physics, why did they so consistently stop at the boundaries between old construction and new? The burning zones in the overlays don't fade gradually, they end, often at precisely the point where 18th century architecture gave way to 19th century development. And if technological limitations produce scattered, inaccurate destruction, why do the damage patterns look so coherent? Random scatter should produce random shapes. These shapes have edges, boundaries, definition. The legitimate explanations account for perhaps 60 or 70% of what the maps show. They explain why city centers suffered. They explain why old quarters burned. They don't explain the precision. They don't explain the consistency across different wars, different armies, different technologies, different decades. They don't explain why the pattern holds in cities with no strategic value whatsoever. University towns, cultural centers, places whose only military significance was existing in the path of armies that could have bypassed them entirely. The explanations are necessary, but insufficient. They describe what happened without explaining why it kept happening to the same kind of places in the same kind of ways. Something else was operating alongside the military logic, something the official histories don't address. Something the official histories don't address. And it's not hidden. That's what kept bothering me as I returned to the overlays. The anomalies aren't buried in classified archives or suppressed by authorities. They sit in publicly available photographs, openly published damage assessments, freely accessible city plans. Anyone can see them. Almost no one looks. Consider the targeting of civic structures with no military function. Town halls and market squares, municipal theaters, public libraries. Buildings whose only strategic value was their symbolic importance to local populations. Terror bombing, the historians explain. Break civilian morale by destroying civilian landmarks. Make the population feel vulnerable by erasing the spaces where they gathered, celebrated, governed themselves. And this explanation works until you notice which civilian landmarks attracted the most thorough destruction. Not the 19th century department stores, not the modern municipal buildings constructed in the decades before the wars. The old structures, the stone structures, the buildings with the anomalous proportions and the impossible construction techniques, and the doors that accommodated someone significantly larger than their documented users. Freiburg's medieval center, destroyed in 1944 by Allied bombers who reportedly mistook it for a different city entirely. A navigation error, according to official accounts. The bombs fell 25 kilometers from their intended target. 25 kilometers is a significant error even by the standards of 1940s aviation. But the destruction was thorough. The old city burned. The strange architecture vanished. And post-war reconstruction produced a modern center with standard proportions and no uncomfortable questions. Würzburg, a city with negligible military industry, a city whose primary significance was cultural and architectural. Bombed in March 1945, weeks before Germany's surrender, when the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. Why allocate scarce resources to destroying a city that posed no strategic threat during a conflict's final days? The official answer? Target availability. Other objectives were obscured by weather. Würzburg was visible. Würzburg burned. But what burned? The residence. The Prince Bishop's Palace with its halls scaled for giants and its doorways that mocked the proportions of its supposed 18th century commissioners. The old town with its medieval street plan and its buildings that predated their attributed construction by evidence their materials provided. Over 90% of the historic center, gone, in 17 minutes. I keep returning to specific details like this. Not the broad pattern, that's visible enough, but the individual decisions that make no sense unless the pattern is intentional. Why bomb Lübeck in 1942? A medieval trading city with minimal war industry. A UNESCO heritage site before UNESCO existed. Why target Bath in the Baedeker raids? A Georgian spa town whose military significance was precisely zero. Whose destruction served no purpose except erasing its architecture. Why systematically demolish Monte Cassino, one of the oldest monasteries in Western Christianity, when the Germans weren't even using it for military purposes? Post-war analysis confirmed the monastery was unoccupied when Allied bombers reduced it to rubble. The explanations multiply: terror tactics, navigation errors, target availability, miscommunication between ground forces and air command. Each explanation addresses a single incident. None addresses the pattern that keeps finding the old architecture, the pattern that keeps erasing the same kind of evidence, the pattern that looks less like war and more like demolition with military cover, the pattern that looks less like war and more like demolition with military cover. I started compiling what I began calling mirror moments, instances where different cities and different countries experienced destruction so similar that the photographs could be swapped and no one would notice the difference. The images speak for themselves: before, damage, after. The same three-beat rhythm repeating across borders and decades. Gdansk, Poland. The Hanseatic trading center with its merchant houses and Gothic churches and streets too narrow for the artillery that would eventually flatten them. Before, dense stone architecture with oversized doorways. Damage. 90% of the historic center destroyed in 1945. After, reconstruction that rebuilt facades while eliminating the structural anomalies of the originals. Nuremberg, Germany. The medieval walled city that survived into the 20th century largely intact. Before, half-timbered. Buildings with stone foundations older than their attributed dates. Damage. Allied bombing destroyed the old town almost completely in January 1945. After, careful reconstruction that looks medieval, but contains none of the original materials. Minsk, Belarus. A city destroyed so thoroughly that virtually nothing predating the war survives. Before, photographs show the same Tartarian proportions, the same oversized civic architecture. Damage. 80% of buildings destroyed. After, Soviet reconstruction that erased the old city plan entirely. The mirror moments multiply. Castle. Before, Baroque palaces and medieval quarters. Damage. Over 90% destruction. After, modern city planning with no trace of the original layout. Pforzheim. Before, a medieval center dating to Roman foundations. Damage. Destroyed in 22 minutes during a single raid in February 1945. After, complete reconstruction with modern materials. Hildesheim. Before, medieval market square with thousand-year-old buildings. Damage. Destroyed in March 1945. After, rebuilt as replicas containing nothing of the originals. The pattern crosses to England, Plymouth. Before, medieval Barbican district with Tudor architecture. Damage, the city center destroyed during the Blitz. After, modern reconstruction erasing the pre-war street plan. Bristol. Before, medieval core with half-timbered structures. Damage, the old shopping district destroyed in November 1940. After, modern development replacing the historic center entirely. The pattern reaches Japan, Tokyo. Before, photographs from the Meiji era show architecture with the same anomalous proportions. Stone foundations, oversized doorways, construction techniques that don't match the official timeline. Damage. Firebombing destroyed most of the historic center. After, modern reconstruction with no preservation of pre-war structures. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, the same sequence repeating. Before, old architecture with unexplained characteristics. Damage. Firestorms consuming historic centers. After, modern cities with no physical connection to what stood before. I lined up the photographs, dozens of cities, hundreds of images. The same story told over and over. Dense, ornate, anomalous centers. Total destruction concentrated on the oldest quarters. Modern reconstruction erasing any physical evidence of what preceded it. Different architects, different armies, different stated objectives, same results, same targets, same systematic elimination of the same architectural vocabulary. At a certain point, the word coincidence becomes an insult to the evidence. Something was being removed from the built environment, something that appeared across cultures and continents, something that someone, or many someones operating with similar priorities, wanted gone. The mirror moments don't prove coordination, they don't prove conspiracy, but they prove pattern, they prove consistency. They prove that whatever explanation exists must account for repetition on a global scale. They prove that whatever explanation exists must account for repetition on a global scale. But the bombs were only the first hit. What came after, the reconstruction, the urban renewal, the modernization programs, delivered the second, and in many ways, the second hit was more thorough than the first. Because bombs leave rubble. Rubble can be studied, foundations remain, basements survive, archaeological evidence persists beneath the destruction, waiting for someone to dig. The rebuilding programs made sure no one would dig. Consider what happened in the years immediately following the wars. Across Europe, across Japan, across every theater of destruction, the same sequence unfolded. Emergency housing first, temporary structures on cleared land, then permanent construction, but not on the old foundations, not following the old street plans, not preserving anything that might prompt questions about what stood there before. The rubble itself became a resource. Crushed stone from medieval buildings poured into the foundations of modern apartment blocks. Fragments of Tartarian architecture buried under highways and parking structures. Evidence recycled into the infrastructure of a new world that would never remember the old one. In Berlin, the Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, cleared an estimated 400 million cubic meters of debris. Where did it go? Into the Teufelsberg, an artificial hill built from the ruins of the old city. A literal burial mound for the architecture that once asked uncomfortable questions. The urban planners arrived with blueprints that bore no relationship to what had existed. Wide boulevards replaced narrow medieval streets. Standardized housing blocks erased the irregular footprints of ancient buildings. Modern civic centers, with their 8-foot ceilings and their human-scale doorways, covered the foundations of structures built for someone else. And the populations accepted it. They had no choice. The housing shortage was desperate. Millions of displaced people needed shelter immediately. Questions about architectural preservation seemed obscene when families were living in basements and bomb craters. The urgency was real. The suffering was real. The need for rapid reconstruction was genuine. But the solutions, the specific solutions chosen from the infinite possibilities available, consistently eliminated any physical connection to the pre-war built environment. Streets were widened even when widening wasn't necessary. Building lines were redrawn even when the original lines remained visible. Foundations were demolished even when they could have supported new construction. The old cities didn't just burn, they were unbuilt, systematically, deliberately, with the same consistency that characterized their destruction. And the records followed the architecture into oblivion. City archives burned in the fires. Property registries vanished in the chaos. Construction documents, the original plans showing who built what and when and how, disappeared during routine transfers between temporary storage facilities. What emerged from the reconstruction was a built environment with no memory, cities that looked modern because they were modern, architecture that asked no questions because it had only existed for decades, not centuries. The second hit completed what the bombs began, not damage, not destruction, erasure. A systematic elimination of physical evidence so thorough that questioning it sounds paranoid. And that's the most elegant part of the operation, if operation it was. The very completeness of the erasure makes the erasure invisible. The very completeness of the erasure makes the erasure invisible. But I need to be honest about what I found when I went looking for contradictions. Because any pattern that can't survive scrutiny isn't worth defending. And the archives contain documents that challenge everything I've described. I found the target lists. Not speculation, not interpretation. the actual planning documents from Allied bomber commands, the directives that specified which cities would burn and why. And they don't mention architecture. They don't reference Tartarian proportions or anomalous construction or the elimination of inconvenient evidence. They list rail yards, oil refineries, ball-bearing factories, submarine pens, the infrastructure of industrial warfare, the Casablanca Directive of January 1943, the order that authorized area bombing of German cities, the stated objective, the progressive destruction and dislocation of the German military, industrial, and economic system, and the undermining of the morale of the German people. Military, industrial, economic, morale. Nothing about architecture, nothing about erasing evidence of previous civilizations. Nothing that supports the pattern I've been documenting. The bombing surveys conducted after the war reached similar conclusions. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey analyzed destruction across Europe with exhaustive detail. Their findings: bombing was often inefficient, frequently missed strategic targets, and succeeded primarily through cumulative attrition rather than precise elimination. Cumulative attrition, not systematic targeting of specific architectural types. The German records tell the same story from the receiving end. Civil defense reports, damage assessments, reconstruction priorities, the bureaucratic machinery of a state under bombardment, documenting everything with characteristic thoroughness. And the documents describe chaos, bombs falling where wind carried them, firestorm spreading, according to weather conditions, destruction following the physics of flame and explosive force rather than any deliberate selection of targets. I sat with these documents for days. I wanted them to reveal hidden agendas, coded references, evidence that someone, somewhere, was directing the destruction toward the architecture I'd identified. They didn't. What they revealed was exactly what official history describes: industrial age warfare conducted with industrial age imprecision. Cities burning because cities were targets and targets were hard to hit, and area bombing was the only strategy available. The pattern I'd identified began to waver. Perhaps I was seeing intention where only accident existed. Perhaps the destruction of Tartarian architecture was simply the destruction of old architecture, and old architecture happened to occupy city centers, and city centers happened to burn in 20th-century warfare. Perhaps coincidence really did explain everything. I almost closed the files, almost accepted the official narrative, almost convinced myself that patterns exist only in the minds of those looking for them. But something kept nagging. The documents explained the method. They didn't explain the result. Imprecise bombing should produce imprecise destruction. Random scatter should produce random patterns. Chaos should look like chaos. But the overlays don't show chaos. They show consistency. They show the same type of architecture burning in city after city while other types survived. The target lists aimed at industry. The destruction landed on history. How does imprecision produce such precise results? The documents couldn't answer that question. Neither could the theory they were supposed to break. The documents couldn't answer that question. Neither could the theory they were supposed to break. So I stepped back, let the pattern settle, stopped looking for grand conspiracies and secret directives and shadowy coordinators, asked a simpler question. Instead, what if no one planned it? What if the destruction of Tartarian architecture didn't require a plot? What if war itself, any war, every war, simply functions as a reset mechanism? A periodic clearing of the built environment that serves interests so diffuse they never needed coordination? Consider who benefits when old cities burn. Property developers acquire cleared land without the expense of demolition. Urban planners implement visions that existing buildings would obstruct. Governments establish new administrative centers without negotiating with entrenched property owners. Industries expand into areas previously protected by heritage considerations. None of these beneficiaries need to conspire. They don't need to coordinate their interests or share information or even know each other exists. They simply wait for destruction to create opportunity. Then they act. The pattern emerges not from planning, but from incentive. When old buildings become obstacles to profit, forces accumulate against their preservation. When those buildings burn, for any reason, through any mechanism, The forces that wanted them gone are simply the forces best positioned to exploit their absence. This reframing doesn't require secret agendas. It requires only capitalism, only the ordinary machinery of development and finance and political influence operating across decades and borders. War becomes a tool even when no one wields it as a tool. The destruction serves purposes even when no one directs the destruction toward those purposes. And the Tartarian architecture, if that's what it was, becomes collateral damage twice over. First to the bombs, then to the interests that prefer a built environment with no memory. I found this explanation almost comforting. It removed the need for villains, for coordination, for conspiracy theories that sound paranoid when spoken aloud. But the comfort faded when I examined the implications. Because if war functions as a reset button, regardless of intent, then the pattern I documented isn't an aberration, it's a feature. The built environment gets periodically erased not despite the systems governing modern life, but because of them. And that means the erasure isn't finished. Every city still contains old quarters, buildings that predate modern standardization, architecture that asks questions simply by existing, structures with proportions that don't match their documented histories. If no conspiracy was required to destroy Dresden and Warsaw and Cologne, no conspiracy is required to destroy what remains. Only incentive. Only the same diffuse interests that benefit whenever the old makes way for the new. The calmer lens doesn't produce calmer conclusions. It suggests that what happened to those cities wasn't an event. It was a process still operating, a process that will continue operating until nothing remains that contradicts the official narrative of human history. Not destruction, not conspiracy, something worse, something ordinary. The grinding efficiency of systems that benefit from forgetting. The grinding efficiency of systems that benefit from forgetting. But the systems aren't perfect. They never are. And what slipped through? The fragments, the survivors, the architecture that somehow escaped the burning radius, tells its own story. I started cataloging what remained. A single gate in a German town. The rest of the old quarter destroyed, but this one entrance arch still standing. Its proportions wrong. Its keystone 15 feet above street level. Its iron hinges sized for doors that would weigh more than modern hardware could support. A staircase in a Polish basement. The building above it destroyed in 1944, rebuilt in 1952. But the basement stairs remain from before. Stone treads worn by centuries of footsteps. Risers lower than modern ergonomics. A width suggesting traffic patterns for users larger than those who climb them today. A bridge pier in a French city. The bridge itself demolished and rebuilt twice, but the original pier, the stone foundation sunk in the riverbed, still visible at low water. Its construction technique unmatched by anything built since. Its material, a granite that doesn't exist in local quarries. These fragments persist. They hide in plain sight. They wait for someone willing to look, and what they reveal contradicts the architecture above them. The rebuilders followed old footprints without asking why the footprints existed. They constructed modern buildings on medieval foundations without questioning why medieval foundations exceeded modern specifications. They paved over evidence without examining what they were burying. But the evidence remains, beneath the surface, at the margins, in the corners that escaped attention. I found a municipal building in Bavaria, post-war construction, completely modern, 8-foot ceilings, standard doors, unremarkable in every way. Except the basement. The basement ceilings reach 14 feet. The basement doorways accommodate frames twice the width of those above. The basement stonework predates the official founding of the town by materials analysis. The building above was destroyed in 1945. The building above was rebuilt in 1953. But the basement wasn't rebuilt. The basement was simply covered, sealed with a concrete floor, and forgotten. Until a renovation project in 2015 broke through the floor and discovered rooms that shouldn't exist beneath a building that supposedly had no predecessor. These discoveries happen more often than the official record acknowledges. Construction crews breaking through foundations, utility workers finding tunnels, archaeologists uncovering structures beneath structures beneath structures. The explanations arrive quickly. Medieval storage cellars, Roman ruins. natural cave formations modified by early inhabitants, always explanations that fit, the timeline, always categories that don't require uncomfortable questions. But the proportions don't lie. The measurements don't change to accommodate preferred narratives. The doors remain oversized, the ceilings remain too high, the stonework remains too sophisticated for its attributed era. The survivors prove what the destruction tried to erase. Something was here before. Something built environments we can barely comprehend. Something left traces too deep to burn, too solid to demolish, too persistent to forget entirely. The pattern of destruction becomes more damning when viewed alongside what escaped. They didn't get everything. And what remains is enough to ask the questions they hoped no one would ask. And what remains is enough to ask the questions they hoped no one would ask. But before asking those questions, I need to address the word I've been using. The word that makes academics uncomfortable. The word that gets researchers dismissed as conspiracy theorists before they've presented a single piece of evidence: Tartaria. The word appears on maps. This is not disputed. European cartographers from the 16th through 19th centuries labeled vast territories across Eurasia with this name: Grande Tartari, Tartaria Magna, Independent Tartari, Chinese Tartari. The maps exist in archives. They can be examined. They are not fabrications. What the word meant to those cartographers, that's where certainty ends. The mainstream interpretation: Tartaria was a vague geographic designation, a catch-all term for territories Europeans didn't understand well, similar to how the Orient described everything east of Vienna without implying a unified civilization. The alternative interpretation: Tartaria was an actual political entity, a civilization spanning continents, a culture that built the architecture I've been documenting, a people who vanished or were vanished from official history. I'm not here to resolve this debate. I lack the expertise and the evidence to make definitive claims about what Tartaria was or wasn't. But here's what I can say with confidence. The architecture exists. The anomalous proportions are measurable. The construction techniques remain unexplained. The photographs predate digital manipulation. The destruction patterns are documented. Whatever we call the civilization that built these structures, the structures themselves are not theoretical. They stood. They were photographed. They were mapped. And then they burned. The name matters less than what the name describes. Call it Tartarian architecture. Call it Old World Imperial style. Call it pre-modern megalithic construction. Call it anything that helps you examine the evidence without triggering automatic dismissal. Because the dismissal is the problem. The word Tartaria has become a thought-terminating cliché. Mention it, and credentialed experts stop listening. Cite the maps, and historians change the subject. Point to the photographs, and debunkers. Attack your methodology rather than addressing your observations. This reaction itself deserves scrutiny. Why does a word on old maps provoke such aggressive dismissal? Why does architectural analysis become conspiracy theory when it suggests official timelines might be incomplete? Why does curiosity about oversized doorways generate ridicule rather than research? The intensity of the reaction suggests the question matters. Irrelevant questions receive bored dismissal. Threatening questions receive active suppression. I'm not claiming Tartaria was a globe-spanning empire erased from history by coordinated forces. I don't have evidence for that claim. I'm claiming something simpler. The architecture documented in pre-war photographs doesn't match official narratives about who built it, when, and for whom. The destruction of that architecture correlates with patterns that transcend individual wars and individual armies. The suppression of questions about these observations is real and measurable. Those three claims require no theory about Tartaria. They require only photographs, maps, and the willingness to notice what the evidence actually shows. The name is a door. What matters is what lies beyond it. And what lies beyond it doesn't depend on what we call it. And what lies beyond it doesn't depend on what we call it. It depends on whether you're willing to look for yourself. I've presented patterns. I've shown overlays. I've documented the destruction and the rebuilding and the fragments that survived. But nothing I've said requires you to trust me. The evidence exists. The archives are accessible. The tools are available to anyone with an internet connection and an afternoon to spare. Here's how to begin. Step 1. Find an old map of any European city. 1850 to 1920 works best. These maps predate both world wars while still offering detail sufficient for meaningful analysis. University libraries have digitized collections. National archives provide free access. David Rumsey's map collection contains thousands of examples. Find the historic center, note its boundaries, note the street patterns, the irregular medieval layouts versus the gridded 19th century expansions. Note where the density concentrates. This is your baseline. Step 2. Find a war damage map or aerial photograph from 1940 to 1945. Many cities published damage assessments after the war. The Allied Aerial Reconnaissance Archives contain thousands of images. Some cities maintain digital collections of wartime photography. Compare the destruction zones to your baseline map. Where does the red concentrate? Does it follow the old boundaries or scatter randomly? Does it find the dense historic core or spread evenly across all development periods? Step 3. Find a reconstruction plan from 1945 to 1965. These documents reveal what decisions were made when the rubble was cleared, which streets were widened, which building lines were redrawn, which foundations were demolished rather than rebuilt upon. The reconstruction plans often tell a clearer story than the destruction itself. They show what the planners wanted to erase and what they wanted to replace it with. Step 4. Find contemporary photographs of the same locations. What stands there now? Does any fragment of the pre-war architecture survive? Are there basements, foundations, or structural remnants that predate the current buildings? Visit if you can. Walk the streets. Notice where the old stonework peeks through modern facades. Notice where doorways have been shortened, windows have been filled in, proportions have been altered to accommodate current expectations. The evidence is physical. It exists in 3 dimensions. It can be measured, photographed, documented. 4 steps. Perhaps 2 hours of research for a single city. And by the end, you'll see what I saw. The pattern that can't be unseen once you've noticed. You don't need specialized training. You don't need academic credentials. You don't need expensive equipment or archival access or permissions from authorities. You need only curiosity and the willingness to compare what was with what remains. The archives preserve what the bombs tried to destroy. The photographs remember what the reconstruction programs tried to erase. The evidence waits for anyone willing to assemble it. You stop being a spectator when you do this work yourself. You become a witness. You see with your own eyes what official narratives prefer you never notice. And once you've seen it, you'll understand why the questions matter, even if you never find the answers. Even if you never find the answers. Because I don't have answers, not definitive ones. Not the kind that close investigations and settle debates and let everyone return to comfortable certainties. What I have is clarity about the questions. Wars hit city centers because city centers mattered. This is true. Rail junctions converged downtown. Government buildings clustered in historic cores. Communication infrastructure occupied central locations. Military logic targeted these assets, and the old architecture burned as collateral damage. This explanation is necessary. It accounts for much of what the overlays show, but it's not sufficient. It doesn't explain the precision. It doesn't explain why imprecise bombing produced such consistent results. It doesn't explain why the same architectural vocabulary burned in city after city while other types survived. It doesn't explain why the pattern holds across different wars, different armies, different technologies, different decades. And it doesn't explain the rebuilding, the second hit. The systematic elimination of foundations and street plans and physical evidence, the replacement of memory with modernity, the construction of cities that have no connection to what stood before. Wars destroy. This is what wars do. But the rebuilding was a choice. Every widened street was a choice. Every demolished foundation was a choice. Every standardized building erected on anomalous ruins was a choice. And the choices, viewed collectively, point in a single direction. Away from the past, away from evidence, away from questions that don't fit the established narrative of human history. I'm not claiming this was coordinated. I'm not claiming secret societies or hidden agendas or villains meeting in shadowed rooms to plan the erasure of Tartarian civilization. I'm claiming something that requires no conspiracy. The systems that govern modern life, economic, political, institutional, benefit from forgetting. They profit from cleared land and standardized construction and populations that don't ask uncomfortable questions about who built the buildings their grandparents photographed. No coordination is necessary when incentives align. The past isn't gone. This is what the survivors prove: the basements and foundations and fragments that escape the burning, the proportions that don't match, the doorways that accommodate someone we don't acknowledge. The evidence persists, buried and forgotten, but not destroyed. It's layered, under the parking structures and the apartment blocks and the modern civic centers with their human-scale proportions. Under the streets we walk without knowing what we're walking on. Under the narratives we accept without questioning who wrote them. The city center was rebuilt to forget. The architecture was replaced to eliminate questions. The evidence was buried to maintain a version of history that doesn't include whoever built the buildings we've been examining. But burial isn't destruction, and forgetting isn't erasure. The past waits, under the surfaces, in the archives, in the photographs that preserve what the firestorms tried to consume, waiting for someone to dig. If the old city centers were targeted, whether by intention or by the grinding machinery of systems that benefit from forgetting, then what else was targeted? What else vanished? What else did we inherit without understanding where it came from or who left it behind? The evidence persists, the questions remain open, and the pattern once seen refuses to be unseen. I started this investigation looking at architecture, old photographs, city maps, the routine materials of historical research. I wasn't searching for conspiracy. I wasn't hunting for evidence of erased civilizations or coordinated destruction or the systematic elimination of inconvenient evidence. I was looking at buildings, just buildings. And the buildings told a story that doesn't fit the narratives we've inherited. Doors too tall for their documented users, ceilings too high for their supposed era, stonework too sophisticated for its attributed builders, infrastructure too vast for populations. We're told constructed it with hand tools and horse carts. These observations aren't controversial when applied to ancient Egypt or pre-Columbian America. We accept that older civilizations built structures we struggle to replicate. We celebrate their engineering as mysterious achievements of the ancient world, but apply the same observations to 19th century Europe and suddenly you're a conspiracy theorist. Suddenly the photographs lie. Suddenly measurements become unreliable. Suddenly asking questions becomes evidence of mental instability. The double standard itself tells a story. We're allowed to wonder about the pyramids. We're not allowed to wonder about the buildings our great-grandparents photographed. We can question how ancient peoples moved massive stones. We cannot question how recent peoples did the same thing with the same materials at the same scale. The boundary is artificial. It exists not because the evidence differs, but because the implications differ. Ancient mysteries are safe. They don't threaten current narratives about progress and development and the steady march of human civilization from primitive origins to modern sophistication. Recent mysteries are dangerous. They suggest the march wasn't steady. They imply the narrative contains gaps. They raise the possibility that we've forgotten more than we've learned. And so, the questions aren't asked. The patterns aren't examined. The photographs gather dust in archives while historians explain away the anomalies with terminology that sounds authoritative but explains nothing. Ceremonial proportions, representative architecture, civic grandeur, aesthetic choices, words that describe without explaining, categories that classify without investigating, answers that exist to prevent questions rather than resolve them. I don't know who built the structures I've documented. I don't know why they built them at that scale. I don't know what happened to the builders or why their architecture burns with such suspicious consistency whenever wars provide convenient cover. But I know the questions deserve asking. I know the pattern deserves investigation. I know the evidence deserves better than dismissal and ridicule and the comfortable certainties of narratives that don't account for what the photographs preserve. The old city centers burned. The strange architecture vanished. The rebuilding programs erased what the bombs didn't destroy, and we inherited a world with no memory of what stood before. But memory isn't the only form of evidence. The photographs remain. The maps remain. The fragments and foundations and survivors remain. The past is layered beneath our feet, waiting for someone to dig. What will you find when you start looking? And what will you do with what you find? The archives are open. The evidence is accessible. The questions are waiting. Everything else is up to you.